In the spring of 1940, Western Europe stood on the edge of collapse. Hitler's armies had unleashed a new kind of war, the fast, ruthless, and unstoppable blitzkrieg. In just weeks, Nazi tanks had torn through Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France, shattering the defenses that were meant to protect the free nations of Europe. Britain's expeditionary force, sent months earlier to defend France, now found itself trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, surrounded by German divisions and hammered from the skies by the Luftwaffe. It was a scene of desperation. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers with their backs to the sea, waiting for rescue that seemed impossible. But through military improvisation, civilian heroism, and utter defiance, a humiliating defeat was transformed into an astonishing deliverance that would lift a nation through its darkest hour. Dunkirk was not a major port. Its shallow beaches and tidal flats made large-scale evacuation seem unachievable. But for the encircled Allied forces, it was the only available channel port, not under German assault. The Royal Navy's senior command initially estimated that only 30,000 to 45,000 men might be rescued. The operation was codenamed Operation Dynamo, after the dynamo room beneath Dover Castle, where the evacuation headquarters was established. It was placed under the command of Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, a calm, methodical officer who now faced one of the most daunting logistical challenges in military history. The plan was simple: hold a defensive perimeter around Dunkirk long enough to evacuate as many troops as possible using every available vessel. But in reality, it was chaos. German artillery and aircraft pounded the beaches daily. Roads were clogged with refugees, and the Luftwaffe had near total control of the skies. Ramsay's naval officers scrambled to assemble a fleet. The Royal Navy's destroyers were too few and too vulnerable to handle the sheer numbers. Ramsay called for an extraordinary solution: civilian vessels, yachts, fishing boats, tugs, barges, ferries, anything that could cross the channel and carry men home. It was an act of sheer improvisation, born of necessity. As the Allied forces crowded toward Dunkirk, the German army seemed unstoppable. Then, on May 24, 1940, Hitler issued one of the most controversial orders of the war, the infamous Halt Order. German tank divisions, which had driven the Allies to the coast in record time, suddenly stopped their advance. Instead of finishing off the trapped forces, they were ordered to hold their positions. Historians still debate Hitler's reasoning. Some suggest he was swayed by Hermann Göring, who promised that the Luftwaffe could destroy the trapped armies from the air. Others believe Hitler feared overextending his armor across the swampy Flanders terrain, or wished to conserve his tanks for the next phase of the campaign. There is also evidence that Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, a senior German commander, recommended the pause to regroup. Whatever the motive, the result was momentous. For 3 critical days, from May 24th to May 27th, German armored divisions waited, and the Allies used that time to dig in around Dunkirk and prepare for evacuation. Churchill would later call Hitler's decision one of the greatest mistakes of the war. On May 26, 1940, Operation Dynamo officially began. Luftwaffe bombers raked the beaches, sinking ships and igniting oil fires that turned the channel into a black inferno. Much of Dunkirk's harbor was too damaged to use, so thousands of troops waded from the beaches to small boats, which ferried them to larger destroyers waiting offshore. In some areas, soldiers queued for hours in waist-deep water, clutching rifles above their heads as Luftwaffe bombers circled overhead. Each day, the scale of the operation grew. British engineers built improvised piers from trucks and wreckage. Naval officers coordinated hundreds of vessels under relentless pressure. Ramsay's operations room beneath Dover Castle never slept. Phone lines buzzed day and night as new ships were dispatched. By May 29th, nearly 47,000 men had been rescued. On May 30th, another 53,000. The Royal Navy's destroyers, supported by French, Belgian, Dutch and Polish vessels, shuttled endlessly across the Channel. At the height of the evacuation, ships were departing Dunkirk almost continuously. What made Operation Dynamo legendary were not the warships, but the civilians who joined the effort. One such civilian was Charles Lightoller, a 66-year-old retired naval officer and the last surviving officer from the Titanic. When the call came for civilian vessels, Lightoller volunteered his motor yacht, Sundowner, and set out across the Channel with his son and a small crew. Despite attacks from German aircraft, the Sundowner reached Dunkirk, packed roughly 130 soldiers into a vessel built for 20, and returned safely to England. Stories like Lightoller's became part of British folklore. Fishermen from Ramsgate, barge skippers from the Thames, and even private citizens who had never seen combat risked everything to bring their countrymen home. They zigzagged across the Channel, dodging Luftwaffe bombs by sailing at night, hiding in smoke, or hugging the coastline. The German pilots referred to the evacuation as the Dunkirk shooting range, yet their attacks failed to break the operation. British Spitfires and Hurricanes from the Royal Air Force engaged them over the beaches in brutal dogfights. Pilots were ordered to fight at the limits of their range, often ditching their planes in the Channel after running out of fuel. Many never returned. Their sacrifices, though unseen by the men on the beaches, kept the Luftwaffe from inflicting total destruction. While Ramsay's fleet battled time and tide, Winston Churchill, who had been Prime Minister for barely 2 weeks, faced turmoil in London. The War Cabinet debated whether Britain should seek a peace deal with Germany through Italian mediation. Some ministers feared that the BEF's annihilation would make continued resistance impossible. Churchill was under immense pressure, but he refused to yield. He believed that even if France fell, Britain must fight on. During one tense meeting on May 28th, he told his ministers bluntly, "If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." That same night, Churchill authorized the evacuation to continue to the last man. He understood that if the BEF were destroyed, Britain would have no army left to defend itself. Every life saved at Dunkirk would mean another chance to fight again. He also managed the flow of information carefully. The public was told little of the scale of the disaster until the success of the evacuation became clear. Churchill walked a fine line, maintaining morale without feeding delusion. On June 4th, after the final ships returned, he addressed Parliament with words that became immortal. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." Churchill's words found a way to turn a desperate nation into one of defiance. When the operation finally ended, roughly 338,000 men had been rescued, 198,000 British and 140,000 French and Belgian troops. The number far exceeded the original estimate, but the cost was high. The Royal Navy lost 6 destroyers and over 200 vessels, and thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. On June 22, 1940, France would officially surrender to Nazi Germany, just 18 days after the end of the evacuation. In military terms, Dunkirk was a defeat. Britain had lost nearly all its heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, vehicles, and ammunition. The BEF returned home armed with little more than rifles. Yet, paradoxically, Dunkirk became a symbol of triumph. The British press dubbed it the Miracle of Dunkirk. Newspapers ran photographs of soldiers climbing from boats, drenched but smiling, onto English shores. The stories of fishermen and yacht owners, men who had defied bombs and bullets to rescue strangers, spread across the nation. For the first time in the war, ordinary Britons felt personally part of the fight. Churchill, wary of overconfidence, cautioned the nation, "Wars are not won by evacuations." But even he recognized that Dunkirk had changed the country's spirit. It had transformed panic into purpose. The British people, once uncertain and divided, now believed they could endure whatever lay ahead. The Dunkirk spirit became a national ethos, one of courage, cooperation, and quiet defiance. Across the country, volunteers joined the Home Guard, women enlisted in civil defense, and factories began rearming for the long struggle. Dunkirk had given Britain hope to continue the fight. The aftermath of Dunkirk was sobering. Britain now stood alone against Nazi Germany. Hitler expected the British to seek peace. Instead, he found a nation newly galvanized. Churchill's speeches, broadcast over radio, strengthened the public's resolve. Behind the scenes, the British government began preparing for likely Nazi invasion. But the morale born at Dunkirk would carry the country through the coming storms: the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, and the long years before D-Day. For Germany, Dunkirk was a missed opportunity. The halt order remains one of the most debated decisions of the war, a tactical pause that allowed the Allies to escape and ultimately regroup to return 4 years later to liberate Europe. The miracle at Dunkirk was made possible by military improvisation, logistical brilliance, and a stroke of enemy hesitation. Above all, it was the product of ordinary people refusing to abandon one another. From the smoke of Dunkirk rose a lesson for all time, that even in the face of catastrophe, unity and courage can turn survival itself into an act of defiance.